We just did the palate, and now we're going to continue with the maxilla, a little bit which was left. As I said, just draw these diagrams so you understand what we are doing. This is the orbit. Now here in the orbit is a canal. This is the bone below the orbit, which was the maxillary bone, and there this is also this is actually a canal, while this is a foramen. This foramen is called infraorbital foramen. Infra means inferior, orbital means it is referring to the orbit. So this means that it is inferior to the orbit if you try to understand the meaning of it. So this is the foramen which is inferior to the orbit, right? This is the infraorbital foramen, and over here in the base of the orbit there is a canal which is called the infraorbital canal. So in the maxilla, this is the maxilla. So this is in the maxilla. In the maxilla, there are over here the teeth. These are for the teeth. There are the superior alveolar sockets in the maxilla, and infraorbital canal communicates with the infraorbital foramen, and through these the infraorbital nerve and artery passes. There's just very brief detail about the zygomatic bone that you need to know. That there are two foramen in the zygomatic bone, the zygomaticofacial and zygomaticotemporal. The zygomaticofacial foramen, I'll write the spellings for you. Zygomaticofacial foramen. You'll be able to see this foramen from the anterior aspect of the skull, and the second foramen is zygomaticotemporal. This will be seen in the side of the skull. It will be very easily be seen from the side of the skull. So the inferior nasal concha. We also did this, and the inferior nasal concha is a shelf-like structure. We saw it in the atlas as well. Just keep your atlas open while you study, because that's like the most important thing you can do, because that makes concept, that puts picture in your head. That is why I'm drawing things, so that puts a picture in your head. So shelf-like structure in the lateral wall of your nose. That's all you need to know about it right now. Most of us do not have a clear concept of the bone that we are going to do now. It is the one and only palatine bone. For me, I just knew for the first chapter, I just knew that it was a bone in the mouth that forms the roof of the oral cavity. That is all I knew, because that was what I could see in picture. But I have to make a picture in my head of what it actually is. It has two parts. The first is the horizontal part, that is known as the horizontal plate, and the other is the perpendicular part, or the perpendicular plate. The horizontal plate will participate in formation of posterior 1/3 of hard palate and one other thing, there's a diagram for it too, just for the concept. Let me make it there. These are two L's. The thing I made in the middle is the septum. This is the perpendicular part of the palatine bone, and this is the horizontal plate. Now, for the information, no, which is just not for the information, actually, horizontal plate is making the roof of the oral cavity. We all know that horizontal plate is making the roof of the oral cavity with the posterior 1/3 of the hard palate, and it is also making the floor of the nasal cavity. So, plus the floor of nasal cavity. So anteriorly the floor of the nasal cavity is formed by the maxillary bone. Write it down. The floor of the nasal cavity anteriorly is formed by the maxillary bone, and posteriorly it is formed by the horizontal bone, a horizontal plate of the palatine bone. And the lateral wall of the nose is made by perpendicular plate of the palatine bone and inferior concha. Continuing it, we'll make another diagram for the understanding, of course. There's a fossa between the pterygoid plate and the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone. The pterygoid plate is of the sphenoid bone, and we'll do the sphenoid bone later. So write it down. The fossa between pterygoid plate and the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone is called the pterygopalatine fossa, and it is below the apex of the orbit. Diagrammatically, I can show you like this. This is the frontal bone. This is the orbit. This is the apex of the orbit. Now this is the perpendicular plate of the palatine bone. This is the maxilla infraorbital fissure. These are the teeth. This is the oral cavity, of course, mandible. And over here almost, there will be the pterygopalatine fossa. This is the sphenoid bone and this is the pterygoid plate. Below the apex there is this, over here is the pterygopalatine fossa. Anyways, there's also a foramen in the perpendicular plate, and that is the sphenopalatine foramen. This foramen will be over here. This will connect the pterygopalatine fossa with the uh, uh, the pterygopalatine fossa will be connected with the pterygopalatine fossa will be connected with the sphenopalatine foramen. Sphenoid bone will be connected to the palatine bone, and through it can go into the oral cavity and the nasal cavity. I'm very sleepy right now. I don't know. Anyways, so there's another thing. If you draw it like this, just look for the atlas for these parts, but I'm actually trying to draw it as well. This is, you know what? Here there'll be a canal that is the lesser, and there are two canals over here. I won't be able to draw these properly, but there are two canals, lesser palatine canal and the greater palatine canal. The greater palatine canal passes the greater palatine nerve and vessel, while the lesser passes the lesser palatine nerve and vessel. Oral cavity can communicate through these to the pterygopalatine fossa. Now, there was one other bone that we talked about. I don't know why I'm doing this. I'm just saving space, I guess. Vomer. Vomer participates in the formation of the nasal septum. Participates in formation of nasal septum. And nasal septum is actually formed by three bones, as I talked earlier. One of them is vomer. Now I'm going to get done with the ethmoid bone. I find this bone quite interesting. This is the bone which forms the roof of our nasal cavity, which is another very interesting thing about this bone, of course. The crista galli are in the anterior cranial fossa, and that is what we know if you have studied it already, because we're just revising it. It's a crash course, but I'll just help you do that as well. So what did I draw? Till here, this part, it is the vomer. But when we come down to here and I'm drawing the ethmoid bone, the diagram to make it easier. Oh, I destroyed it. Just leave that part. This is nothing. Anyways, I think I've drawn everything. No, I haven't. Actually, I can draw more like this. You will be quite confused at what my drawing. Trust me, it is gonna be fun because I just want you to draw it with me so you don't have problem later. I'll show you the neat one. I don't have very neat work though, but as neat as I can go. This is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. This part is the crista galli. This is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. Write it down. This is vomer, which makes the septum, nasal septum. This is the nasal process of maxilla. We have, this is this over here. We'll draw it like this. This over here is the cribriform plate, and these that are drew with the marker were the neurons, the olfactory receptors, the bipolar ones. So these were the olfactory receptors. This was the hole as a cribriform plate through which the olfactory receptors were passing through, and this is the olfactory bulb, and these are the olfactory nerves. One thing which I missed are these. These are the nasal concha, superior, middle, inferior nasal concha, and I'll mark one of these. You can mark all. This is superior, this is middle, but I'll write this one completely, inferior nasal concha. Now the question which is left is that what is this rectangular part that I haven't explained yet? Let's just leave it for the later. I'll explain it then, like in a minute or two. Cristagalli is the anterior. This cristagalli are in the anterior cranial fossa. Olfactory nerve fibers pass through the cribriform plate, and cribriform plate makes the floor of the anterior cranial fossa. This cribriform plate makes the floor of the anterior cranial fossa and roof of the nasal cavity. Olfactory receptors are present in the roof of the nasal cavity, and olfactory receptors make up the membrane at inferior surface of the cribriform plate. Now I'll show you a neat diagram so you can actually see it properly. Okay, so now as you can see it clearly, the olfactory receptors, which are these, the marker ones, make the floor of the anterior cranial fossa and roof of the nasal cavity, and the olfactory receptors are present in the roof of the nasal cavity. Olfactory receptors make up the olfactory membrane at inferior surface of the cribriform. Olfactory receptors make up the olfactory membrane. If somebody asks you what olfactory membrane is, it is made up of the olfactory receptors, and it is at the inferior surface of the cribriform. When ethmoid bone, that is the cribriform plate, damages or fractures, the fracture of the base of the skull takes place. So the CSF will start coming out of the nose. CSF is the cerebrospinal fluid in which our brain and all its parts are floating, and it is in our central canal of our spinal cord as well. Now there is a communication formed when this CSF starts to come out from there's a communication formed between the exterior and the brain, which can cause meningitis. That is, the infections may go through it and cause meningitis. Then the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, that was, as you can see, this one. The perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone is one of the bones that make up the septum. There are 3 bones that make up the septum. The one first is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, and that makes up the and then there is the vomer, and then there's a nasal process of the maxilla, as you can see in the diagram as well. Now the next diagram related to the ethmoid bone. Over here that triangular thing is explained properly. So The orbital plate of the ethmoid bone is this part. This plate over here is the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone, and this is the orbit. And over here, this is the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone. And the rest, you know what it is. So, orbital plate of the ethmoid bone contains a cavity known as ethmoidal air sinus. Which air sinus have we studied before? I think we have studied the frontal sinus. There are 4 sinuses indeed. I'll just tell you in start because we're here. There will be another sinus, but there are 4 sinuses: nasal air sinuses, ethmoidal, sphenoidal, frontal, maxillary. We have done maxillary, we have done ethmoidal, we have done frontal. We have done 3. 1 is left. We'll do it later. The ethmoidal air sinus, about it, the sinusoitis of the ethmoidal air sinus can occur. Like the sinusoitis of the frontal air sinus could occur. So the sinusitis occurs, and when it is the tumor or the infection of in the ethmoidal air sinus, and then it can because of the size or because of the infection may grow up, and that can enter the orbit. It will push the orbit, and that will be the protrusion of the eyeball, that is pushing the eyeball, and then the protrusion of the eyeball, and then the proptosis may occur. This is the same thing that happened in the infection of the maxillary air sinus, not the frontal, I'm sorry. I don't think frontal will cause it, but let's just do it for the while. So the infection of the maxillary air sinus can cause the same problem, and medial wall of the orbit is formed by the orbital plate of the ethmoidal bone. After this, we'll do the orbit. Stay tuned. We know it already that the orbit is made up of bones and it must contain something, obviously. So there is a common question about the contents of the orbit, and these are many, but we need to just go through them like in an easy way so you don't have to cram them. So what is the first thing that you can see in the orbit? If you look at somebody directly, you'll see the eyeball, of course. So the eyeball is there. Then there's there's also the orbital fascia. That is like an obvious thing. So there'll be the eyeball. The first thing you can write is the eyeball. Then there is the optic nerve. There is let's write it down. Eyeball, 1. Then there will be the optic nerve. Then the extra ocular muscles, of course. If you've done anatomy even once before, you'll know about these, but you have to learn these. So the cranial nerves are also present. Now, which cranial nerves is important? Branches of the third cranial nerve, which is the oculomotor nerve. Fourth cranial nerve itself, which is the trochlear nerve. Branches of the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. And the sixth cranial nerve, which is the abducent nerve. Now, if you know what ophthalmoscopy is, you'll know that we're talking about the eye, and there'll be the ophthalmic artery with its branches. About the ophthalmoscopy, I was just trying to make a relation so you remember what ophthalmoscopic is. Ophthalmic, the orbit may contain the ophthalmic artery and its branches is another content which is and branches. Ophthalmic vein, ciliary ganglion. This is the ganglion which is present in the orbit, and this was asked a lot of times in the vivas. So retrobulbar and orbital fascia is also present here. So this is the contents of the orbit. I hope you understand these. Moving forward with the boundaries of the orbit, I am folding the page, wasting time, I know. Anyways, this is it. Now we're gonna do the orbits. Orbit, boundaries. Roof, medially, floor, and laterally. I'm making these pretty rough, but please, please, please make them as neat notes of yours, because that is very important. These things comes in paper and you need time to you do not really have time to revise. Orbital plate of frontal bone, as we did earlier, forms the roof. Medially there is the lacrimal bone, and as we did earlier, there is the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone. The floor is formed by the orbital plate of maxilla, and the lateral wall is formed by the greater wing of sphenoid. As we did earlier. I showed you the lateral wall in the atlas as well, and I showed you the orbit in the atlas as well, so I'll show you the neat notes in a bit. So as you're taking time to revise it, as you're taking time to write it, I'm going to revise it. So the contents of the orbit are the eyeball, the optic nerve, the extraocular muscles, the cranial nerves, the branches of the third cranial nerve, fourth cranial nerve itself, the fifth cranial nerve, ophthalmic division, the sixth cranial nerve, that is the abductor nerve. Why does the fourth and the sixth cranial nerve come here? I'm going to tell you in a bit while you write it. So the ophthalmic artery also comes in, and its branches, and the ophthalmic vein, the ciliary ganglion, and retrobulbar and orbital fascia. The boundaries, as we did earlier, the roof is formed by the orbital plate of the frontal bone, while the medially there is the lacrimal bone and the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone. Floor is formed by the orbital plate of the maxilla, lateral wall is formed by the greater wing of sphenoid. Now, what I said earlier, there are the muscles of the eyes, and out of those muscles, the superior oblique muscle is supplied by it is the only muscle indeed which is supplied by the fourth cranial nerve. There is no other muscle that this nerve supplies. After that, there is the abductor nerve, that is the sixth cranial nerve. This cranial nerve supplies the lateral rectus. This is just for the revision's sake, and I will do these with you again, the muscles of the eye, of course. But right now, I'm just trying to put it in your head. So the lateral rectus, that is LR6, we do it like in the morning. LR6 is supplied by the abducent nerve, that is lateral rectus muscle. Is supplied by the abducent nerve, and all the other muscles are supplied by the third cranial nerve, and that is it.